The second lesson is from the Gospel according to Matthew. This is one of those parables that'll make you sit up and pay attention. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guest, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" This is the word of the Lord. Let us pray. Meet us where we are this day, O God, and open our hearts to you. Amen. Have you ever been to a party and you knew immediately that you were wearing the wrong clothes? That you were either overdressed or you were underdressed. So let's imagine just for a moment that for whatever reason, you arrived at a party underdressed. Maybe you didn't read the small print on the end of the invitation, and when you went in, you mingled for a while, and then the host came over to greet you. They looked you over, and he or she said, "Oh, it's so good to see you here. But in those clothes, really? I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Did you hear that parable from Jesus? Something like that happens in this story. The parable tells us that the king's son is getting married. It's a big deal. A major event. When it's time to start the festivities, the king sends out his servants to invite in the guest. Perhaps the servants say something like, "I'm here from the king. It's time for the wedding gala to begin. Please come." The invited guests, however, do not. So the king sends more servants with the same message, that the king is throwing a huge party. The hors d'oeuvres are ready, the bar is stocked, the table is full. So, come now. But the invited guests snicker. They make light of the king's invitation. Some go home, some go to work, while still others grab the king's servants and kill them. Of course, the king is furious, so he sends in the troops to deal with those murderers and decides, my son is getting married, and we're going to have a party one way or another. So he calls in more servants and says, the wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you can to the wedding. And they do. The servants invite the good, the bad, the beautiful, the ugly, those from the posh areas and those who've been sleeping on the streets. And in the end, the banquet hall is filled with guests. And then the shocking part of the story. The king comes in and sees the wedding hall full, but he notices a man who's not dressed properly for the occasion. The king confronts the underdressed guest and says to him, friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment? The man is speechless. So the king calls over his bouncers, and they throw the poorly dressed guest out of the banquet hall and into the streets. And the parable ends. Now, if you're like me, the first time you heard this parable, we thought, holy cow. I mean, really? I mean, what's going on here? If this is an allegory where, with the symbolism where God is the king, then what's the meaning of the guest being thrown out because he is underdressed? The king is insensitive, to say the least, but it sounds more like he is cruel and harsh, even petty. Is God that way? Does God really care what we wear? Is there a dress code when it comes to approaching or being in the presence of God? Now, I'm pretty sure that my mother would like this parable to be about proper dress. But if you'll hang on for a minute, I think we'll discover something else. In first century Palestine, it was customary to wear a long, clean wedding garment to a wedding. The more elegant a garment you could afford, the better. Not to dress up, but to wear ordinary clothes or worn clothes or dirty clothes was an insult to the host. By not wearing your best, you demeaned and you dishonored both the host and the guest of honor. In this parable, the host is a king, which of course doubles the stakes. I mean, we would not go to the governor's black tie gala or to the president's inaugural ball in a sport jacket or business casual, would we? No. Now, some biblical commentators say that in first century Middle Eastern culture, the king would provide the wedding garments for the arriving guests. If that's true, it means that the parable's dressed down guest has chosen not to change his clothes when he arrives at the wedding banquet. And the listeners of the first century hearing this parable would have understood that. Therefore, the underdressed guest didn't think it was important to change his clothes, showing that he was either disrespectful, arrogant, or just didn't care. Whatever, he gets thrown out. My mother would love this parable. But hold on, because this is not about proper dress. This is about being invited to God's great banquet of faith and thinking that we can come as we are. This is about God inviting us into God's presence, into God's kingdom, into a divine human relationship, and thinking we can keep wearing the same old clothes, the same old inner clothes, the same old attitudes, the same old character, the same old unchanged perspective and values. That changing the clothing of the heart is not a requirement. You with me? This parable says that when we are invited into God's kingdom, it's not enough just to attend. In Christian faith, there's always a tension between grace and works. Some of us want the gospel to focus on the grace of God. Others of us want the gospel to focus on our accountability and our works. So here in the parable, we see how this tension is played out. In the first part of the parable, it is very inclusive. It is chock full of grace. And it's important for us to understand that Jesus tells this parable in the context of his own disappointment with the Jews, with God's people who have been invited into a new way of life, but they have not responded to Jesus or his gracious invitation. But through the ministry of Jesus, everyone is invited. Everyone is invited to God's table, even the Gentiles, even the tax collectors, even the cheats, even the harlots, the social misfits, and all those whose lives seem to be so unworthy. Everyone has an invitation. No one is excluded. That's the grace. But even though everyone has been invited, not everyone gets to stay. Those who don't change their clothes, change their character, change their attitude, change their heart, they get tossed out of the banquet and into the streets. Whereas the first part of the parable is all about grace, the second part of the parable is about our response to grace. Which is to say, grace is a gift, and grace is free, but grace is not cheap. It demands a response. When it comes to grace and response, I often think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. You know Bonhoeffer, the German theologian who went underground to defy Hitler and Nazi evil. In the midst of his resistance, he wrote an extraordinary book called The Cost of Discipleship. And in it, Bonhoeffer challenges the cheap grace going on among German Christians. Grace was free, Bonhoeffer said, but it's not cheap. It demands a response. In his Germany in the 1930s and 40s, Jews, gypsies, gays, lesbians, even some Catholics were being targeted for persecution, were being marginalized, having their dignity stripped, their rights taken away, and millions eventually were killed in the Holocaust. Before many realized how bad this would get or how serious this was, Bonhoeffer questioned the response of German Christians and the German church to all that was going on. They seemed to be complacent in the idea that they were saved by grace, thought Bonhoeffer. But they could not see that grace was free, but it was not cheap. In Bonhoeffer's mind, German Christians were practicing cheap grace. Bonhoeffer demonstrated a response to grace with his own life. As the churches became increasingly co-opted by the Nazi state, he set up his own seminary illegally to train future ministers. And he also risked his life by becoming involved in a secret movement to rid Germany of Hitler. Bonhoeffer had been involved in ecumenical work long before Hitler came to power, and which meant that he had a diplomatic status to travel for ecumenical gatherings and meetings, which often meant he could travel outside the country. So using his credentials, he began acting as a go-between between Allied diplomats and disillusioned German military officials. Eventually, Bonhoeffer was discovered, or at least folks became suspicious. He was arrested, he was imprisoned, and just days before the end of World War II, he was hanged by the Gestapo. Bonhoeffer reminds us that though we are invited to the great banquet, a change of clothes, a change of heart and soul is required. So what's the meaning of the parable? Grace is free, but it's not cheap. A response to grace is required. Proper attire in the kingdom means we put on some new clothes of the heart. Of course, the truth is that most of us think, well, we're doing pretty well just to be a church member these days, or to be in church this morning when God knows people are at Starbucks and at the gym and walking through their neighborhood and watching the morning news shows and reading the New York Times. I mean, at least we're here, right? But Jesus, in this parable, sends us a different message. Once we come in, we can't wear the same old clothes. It's also a really important message to the church. Our American church sits in a culture that defines success by numbers, by numbers of people, by buildings, by budgets. And our temptation in the church is to play a numbers game with people, or with money, or with buildings, where we assure ourselves that we're being successful at being the church, right? What this parable suggests, however, is that warm bodies are not what God's looking for. Yes, everyone is invited to God's party, but to stay, we got to take off our old clothes of pride and prejudice and indifference and apathy and not being concerned about justice for our brothers and sisters. And we got to dress up. Dress up with some new clothes of the soul like love, joy, peace, patience, and all those fruits of the Spirit. Which reminds me of what my school teacher mother would require when she would take her classroom kids off on a school trip. She would make them dress up. Why? Because she believed that kids act better when they're dressed better. Coming into the banquet hall of faith is an important first step. But putting on the new clothes of the gospel, of the heart and soul, well, that's the proper attire.